Hello, I'm Shelley Fulnasso, CEO of the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship, and I'm thrilled to host tonight's event to discuss Judith Pearson's new book, From Shadows to Life, a biography of the cancer survivorship movement. We host webinars and policy roundtables and advocacy symposia, but this is my first book event with the author. Judy is an author and breast cancer survivor who founded Second Act, a nonprofit that raises funds through live storytelling performances and conducts workshops helping guide women survivors as they discover their second acts. You can read more about Judy's biography on our website. I'm delighted that Judy could join us tonight, as well as two people who figure prominently in the book and in the survivorship movement. Susan Lay, one of the founding members of NCCS, who was present at the meeting in Albuquerque, New Mexico, at which NCCS was founded 35 years ago, and who has given of her time and energy as an advocate ever since. And Dr. Julia Rowland, who was the director of the National Cancer Institute's Office of Cancer Survivorship for many years, and who joined, or should I say rejoined, the board of NCCS when she retired from NCI 3 years ago. I'm excited to host these three amazing women tonight. Sorry, I'm in my office and our cleaning staff came in, so sorry about that. But it's what happens in Zoom meetings. So I'm excited to host them. And so Lindsay and I, when we get to interview cancer survivors and experts, like to say that we're channeling our inner Oprah. But after Oprah's interview with Harry and Meghan the other night, it is clear that Oprah is the master of interviewing, and there's no way I can compare. But I don't expect that we're going to have any bombshells in this discussion. It would be great if we did, because I would love to practice my what, like Oprah did, but I just don't think that it's going to be quite that kind of interview. So I'm going to start by asking Judy some questions, but then I'll bring in Susie and Julia. But you can feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions, and then we'll get through as many as we can. So every year, many authors write books about cancer, but this book is not just about cancer. It's about the birth and growth of the survivorship movement, and significantly about the history of NCCS. So it's exciting for me to read as someone who joined NCCS almost 8 years ago. I've learned quite a bit about the history of NCCS from reading documents and talking with founders like Susie, Barbara Hoffman, Fitz Mullen, and others, as well as people who shepherded NCCS's growth, like our former CEO, Ellen Stovall. But it's wonderful to be able to read the history in this detailed and researched way. So Judy, will you start by telling us what inspired you to write this book?
Okay, I'm so sorry. My internet froze.
Oh,
That's was there a question?
It was just what inspired you to write this book?
Got it. Thank you. I'm a biographer by profession, and after my own cancer treatment 10 years ago, I just couldn't wrap my mind around the next great speech. So I started a second act, as you mentioned, and as a result of that, an acquaintance of mine said, "Do you know Susie Lay? You need to meet Susie Lay." I live in Phoenix, Susie's in Tucson. And so she did the introduction, and Susie said to me in an email, "I'll probably talk your ear off," when we were planning our lunch. And she did talk my ear off, but then I paid her back by asking thousands of questions. And I was astounded that this, as a student of history, that this was something so close to my own personal background that I knew nothing about. And the rest, as they say, is history.
So how did you go about researching the book after you were inspired by Susie?
I realized that the impact of that group in Albuquerque almost 35 years ago would be far greater to readers who were not cancer survivors if I could set it up. So I went back into the archives in DC and started researching the status of survivorship, and researched old newspapers through an internet database. And so the book actually
Uh-oh. I think we lost Judy for a second.
And then talked about Nixon's National Cancer Act and the war on cancer, and then was able to move forward into Ellen being diagnosed and Susie being diagnosed, which happened just very closely together, and started adding in Fitz's diagnosis, and the whole thing just built upon itself till we got to the grand moment in Albuquerque in 1986.
So you mentioned President Nixon and the National Cancer Act. So why did he declare war on cancer then, and what impact did it have on the disease, and what did it fail to address?
Well, the presidents before him, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, actually hoped to do the same thing. Kennedy's administration, of course, was cut short by the assassination, and President Johnson became so mired down in Vietnam, and so much of the country's treasury was going to the Vietnam War, he simply couldn't pull it off. So as President Nixon was facing his second election, his advisors came to him and said, we need a big push. He had promised to end the Vietnam War with a secret ending, which didn't transpire. And so cancer is a nonpartisan issue, something Democrats and Republicans alike can get behind. The ramp up to the actual act took a lot of political finagling and about nearly 2 years to pull together. But with both sides of the aisle working on it, a year to really kind of beef it up. He also promised to cure the disease by the bicentennial, and of course that didn't happen. But what did happen was $1.3 billion, which was astounding at that time, was funneled into cancer research, and that really turned the tide on the treatments, although, as I said, they were still trying to work toward cure, but the treatments that churned out more and more survivors.
Great. So tell us more about what you learned about how the group of people got together in Albuquerque 35 years ago to start the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship.
And I know I've frozen a couple of times. I'm really sorry. We're having big winds here in Arizona, and every time that happens, our internet becomes unstable. And my husband wired me up, and if my hair goes crazy, that's because I'm wired up. But apparently it's still not working as well as we'd hoped. So when I interviewed Fitz Mullen, he said that they just fell into one another's arms, that they were so astounded at the fact that there were others across the country that felt the same way. Susie will share her own story, but she said to me, she just was shocked. She had felt so silenced about the collateral damage, both the fear of recurrence along with the physical issues. And here were people who were willing to speak about cancer in the open. The other thing to remember is that human beings learned the most dangerous and deadly diseases are contagious. So for a very long time, including up to the era that these folks got together, the contagion myth was still floating around to a greater or lesser extent. So there was fear. Even after NCCS was founded the next year, 20% of all American cancer survivors would face employment discrimination because of their cancer diagnosis. That's astounding.
Yeah. Wow. So, yeah. So, Susie, I'm going to ask you, I'm going to kind of just have all of you in the conversation here. But Susie, how did it feel to be a survivor before there was such a concept of survivor? And then how did it feel to find your colleagues at the NCCS founding meeting? And did you guys think that you were starting a movement at that time?
Well, to start with how I felt, I was originally diagnosed in 1972, and that was just when we were starting to see potentially curative therapy for the first adult cancer, which was Hodgkin's. And so there was no history in front of us. We were told that we have this potentially curative treatment, but there was really very, very little information that we could look at in the future. So I remember meeting a fellow, one of the gals behind the desk in radiation oncology said to me, Susie, here's so-and-so coming out, and he just finished his last treatment. And he ended up being diagnosed 2 months before I was. And to me, that was the historical length of time that I had to look at. And so I grasped onto him and I said, how'd you get through it? How do you feel now? Whatever. So it was really trial and error back then. But there was a new sense of hope, hopefulness. And that hopefulness just changed the whole attitude about having these cancer treatments, where there was no certainly no adequate anti-nausea medications with the chemotherapy regime that was just devastating to our GI systems. So, you got through that, and then you knew you had to come back and do it again. But you knew that if you did that and you got through that there was a chance that you would actually live longer than anyone ever expected. So that was tough. And then once I finished that original course of therapies and started the recovery process, I had a very long recovery for the physiology, because my bone marrow was so suppressed. I didn't have the right blood cells. Well, nowadays we have colony stimulating factors to help us boost those cells. We didn't have that, so it was just time that we had to wait until we could either get back to the next course of therapy or just to start feeling better after it was all over with. So we went through that, and I had peripheral neuropathy, I had a lot of fatigue, but you just got through it. And then I eventually got back to working, and I was very fortunate to get into oncology nursing, which was a brand new field. That was my dream now, was to become an oncology nurse, so that maybe I had something to offer oncology because of my personal experience. And what I've found in the next decade or so was that the healthcare professionals that I worked with had no idea why I was feeling the way I was, why I was still anxious, why I was still afraid that the disease might come back. And I found that the only people who I could relate to at that time were my patients, because there was no support group. And I'd go in thinking that here I was to help my patients, and they ended up helping me as much as I helped them. So after being told that I was too emotional to be in oncology, which I may have been, but I was too emotional, keep her away from patients and she's gonna cry. And I felt, how could people not feel emotional working in this field? So, and a lot of it is my personality too. You can have two oncology nurses with cancer histories, and one will do very, very well and get through, and I could turn out to be a wreck at times. But anyway, I got to this first meeting of NCCS, and I got there by default because another oncology nurse was asked to go to the meeting and she couldn't make it, and so asked if I wanted to go. I was so excited about that, I could hardly stand it. And when I walked into that room, you could just feel that everybody was there knowing what the other person felt like, or what the people they worked with felt like. And they were all very, very invested in helping people survive survivorship. It was surviving the after effects of dealing with cancer. And we didn't have a lot of names for things back then. We didn't have post-traumatic stress disorder for cancer patients at that time. And I just felt an incredible sense of relief and camaraderie, and like I didn't have to convince these folks that I still had continuing issues.
So did you guys think you were starting a movement?
Well, as far as starting, no, I don't think so. Most of us couldn't think that big. Fitz probably did. Fitz had this mind that could really project into the future, and he had such big dreams. If anybody in that room felt we were starting a movement, it was Fitz. Many of us, and me included, really had no idea. And Catherine Logan, who started this with Fitz, had a very, very different type of dream. than fits. So it was really taking these disparate ideas and dreams and trying to put them together to figure out how we could move forward. But there were so many incredible people in the room that over the weekend, it became very clear that we were committed to doing something, not knowing really what that was going to look like.
So, Judy, tell us more about what you learned about that meeting and how it came together. And I know you were so meticulous in terms of looking at even like the hotel that they stayed at and all of the details around that meeting. So, tell us a little bit more about what you learned.
So the type of nonfiction I write is actually called narrative nonfiction, and the idea being that there's setting, there's character development, even though it's all real. And I even hunted down the restaurant they went to that first night. One of the founding members said it was round, it looked like a barrel. And I discovered there is indeed a barrel-shaped restaurant in Albuquerque. I hunted down the owner. And when I started asking him these questions, he said, "How do you know all of this?" And I said, "I'm a researcher." So they stayed at a brand newly remodeled hotel that I guessed at until I came to the NCCS office, and your wonderful Zach hooked me up with archival photos, and sure enough, it was the hotel that I had guessed. For me, I'm just a research junkie. I just absolutely love understanding what it must have felt like and what it must have been like. And I just think that's that's the kind of book I like to read. And so it was important to me to share that, and along with the many histories of the Oncology Nursing Society and oncology social work and psycho-oncology, I wanted all of those professions' histories to kind of wind through this whole thing like a beautiful tapestry. And fingers crossed that's what worked. I hope readers feel like they were really there.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that you can talk to people, and it's been 35 years, so people have different recollections. But you did that kind of research to look at documents as well, and not just relying on people's memories, but looking at I don't know how many years of NCCS newsletters you poured over and other documents to try to get all of that information. But taking a step back a little bit, tell us how the meeting even came about, because I know you talked about Dr. Mullen Fitz's article and Catherine Logan's sort of pursuit of him to try to bring their ideas together. So talk a little bit about that.
Catherine had started a support group, and as Susie indicated, that there weren't many of those. She started a little support group in Albuquerque and had heard about Fitz and actually went to see him speak after his book called Vital Signs came out, which was a story of his own cancer treatment journey, which is really astounding. And so she met him outside the conference room and introduced herself and said, we should get together. We could create a club of people who've had cancer. And he kind of chuckled and thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then she started a letter writing campaign. And he said to me the couple of times that I had the good fortune to interview him face to face, he said she was like a dog with a bone. She wouldn't give up. And so she sort of had this energy to push this forward. He had the Rolodex that he had built from his book signings, and she sent out 87 letters to mostly professions and groups as opposed to individuals. So people who had some connection to cancer, although many of them were survivors like Susie. And of the 87, 23 ponied up the $100 for the 3-night stay at the Barcelona Court Hotel and showed up for this meeting. And it was unfortunately not the weekend of the Great Balloon Fiesta, because that conflicted with Rosh Hashanah, and a couple of their members were Jewish and wanted to attend that. So, but they just all came together and called themselves, they didn't call themselves, afterwards they were called the Continental Congress of Survivorship, which they really were. And it took them less time than the founding fathers to come up with this roadmap for the rest of us to follow.
Great. So Susie, tell us about how you all decided on the term survivor and why you decided to define survivor from the moment of diagnosis as opposed to upon completion of treatment.
Well, the last thing that many of us wanted to be called was a cancer victim, and that was the label that we all were given at the time. And if an organization wanted to raise some money, they would show a poster of somebody very forlorn with no hair, or some kind of a terrible head and neck look on their face, and they would be very, very sad, and we would be the cancer victims. And here was this group of people who were so energized and vibrant, and many of them still were being treated, but they still said, we don't want to just be cancer victims. There's so much more to life than that. And eventually it became, a lot of people said, we just don't want to survive, we want to thrive. So we were looking at people who really wanted to get beyond that very negative label and look. So, they said, well, we're surviving after this. And so we decided that we would look at the term survivor, which up to that time, in my research that I put in a lot of my presentations, the very first time that I saw cancer survivor was in a brochure from an insurance company. And the cancer survivors were those who were left behind when the patient died. Those were the survivors.
Oh my gosh.
And
wow.
Then it moved in pediatrics, was the very first one then, who would call their patient survivors if they lived for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
But we took a look at that in the adult community. We said, look, there are so many more types of adult cancers than there are in pediatrics. And there are different stages of disease. There are different, types of disease with different types of treatments in multiple different age groups. So how can you use 5 years as the parameter for everybody who is ever treated for cancer? I mean, you could go 5 years and 3 days and are you not a survivor? If you recur after that, we didn't know what would happen to many down the road. Many of the people who were being treated at the time, back in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, were developing late effects, within 5 years or so, 10 years or so. So we said that there was just such discrepancy in who actually could be termed a survivor, but we needed to look at people who were living beyond their initial diagnosis. And so when Fitz took a look at the seasons of survival, we said, well, you're surviving in a very different way when you're first diagnosed and treated, but then your survival changes once you go off. And so we said, rather than worrying about labeling who is or is not a survivor, we said, let's talk about survivorship, which is really that journey through the survival continuum, and then extending that continuum of survival into longer term survival, which many of us at that time were. So it was just taking a look at the semantics in a different way. And what I found really amusing over the years is I started collecting labels of what people liked to be called or didn't like to be called. And I know Julie and I both have our lists, and it goes anywhere from, no, I want to be called a patient. I want to be called an activist. I want to be called a warrior. I want to be called an advocate. Someone in Washington, D.C. said, no, we're the blessed. So we went from real militaristic type labels to some very spiritual labels. Some people liked them, some people didn't like them, and that's the way it is today. So I like to say to people, aren't we lucky that we have the luxury now of being called anything we want to be called, and we can argue about it. So it's just a label, but it was a way to help people understand that we were not just cancer victims who were going to die, but we were people who were going to live after our diagnosis, whether we were cured of our disease, whether we had metastatic disease, whether you were in remission or not. There are so many ways to describe us. So it's just kind of a generic look at who we are.
Susie, I love how you always have the ability to bring in the positive. That aren't we lucky that we can have these discussions about what we should be called? That's awesome. So Judy, tell us a little bit more about what you learned about the early years of NCCS and how it grew after it was founded, and then when the NCCS made the decision to move to Washington, D.C., and what that meant for the work of the organization.
So they considered their first meeting in Albuquerque an assembly, the first assembly. And so then at their 1-year anniversary, had their second assembly. And those went on actually for 10 years. The first couple of years were in Albuquerque, and then they moved to other parts of the country. And again, this was such a novel idea. Now we have a really hard time wrapping our minds around that, but it was such a novel idea. Even the National Cancer Survivors Day, that is now, everybody hears about that in June, that was announced at a NCCS assembly. And there would be speakers. They developed a variety of recognitions, awards, I guess you would call it. The first time that Justice Sandra Day O'Connor talked about her own breast cancer was at an NCCS assembly. And I found a C-SPAN video of that, so I was able to get her exact words. And I think the really interesting thing, Deb Ash, who was a part of the office staff and the overall staff several times. She came and went because she moved to Washington, D.C. She said they grew like a grapevine, and they just really did. It was just such a breathtaking ability to be able to come out of the shadows and speak about cancer and have a positive relationship with other cancer survivors. And so one of the early years, a young woman who lived in Washington, D.C., came to the assembly, and she actually was quoted in the Networker newsletter, giving her first-time assembly experience. Her name was Ellen Stovall, who you mentioned. She went on to become the CEO. But the next year, she was the chair of the assembly. And Julia, I think you chaired it with her, didn't you? Wasn't it the two of you?
I think it was that year. I chaired it with Betsy the year I chaired it.
Oh, okay. All right. So Ellen chaired the assembly, and what they began realizing was that being in Albuquerque, they were able to field phone calls. That was Catherine's vision, that people would call in and say, I live in East Cupcake, New Hampshire, or Pitchfork, South Dakota, and I need support. And so they would look through their roster of cancer organizations and send those people to the nearest support. Fitz had the idea that there would be chapters in each state, and that would be the best way for them to grow. And again, they were growing much faster, I think, than any of them really had thought about. And in the end, they became a hybrid of both. But it was recognized that they needed to be between Congress, where funding for cancer research came down, and National Cancer Institute, where much of the cancer research was done. And of course, to do that, and not only funding, but also to drive the legislative acts against discrimination and for cancer survivorship coverage within the healthcare system. And the only place to do that effectively was in Washington, D.C. Not to mention that there was and still is financial toxicity connected to a cancer treatment. And so for many of the survivors, it was difficult financially to get to these assemblies. So the assemblies ended, but the work certainly didn't.
So that's thank you for that great explanation. And of course, as a public policy wonk, I appreciate the value of what we can do here in Washington, D.C. area to really try to impact, cancer survivors on a big level in terms of the policies. So one of those was the creation of the Office of Cancer Survivorship at the National Cancer Institute. Julia, why don't you tell us a little bit about NCCS's role in making that happen and how that happened, and then how you came to lead the organization or
So
the
when
office.
they had their first Congress, so they'd moved the coalition to Washington, D.C., and we had the first Congress. In preparation for that, all of us sort of involved with the coalition at the time, and a lot of clinicians and researchers and survivors and leaders in the area got together and put out a series of 3 white papers that were ultimately merged into one document. And we're kind of like, here are the marching orders for what we need to do. And those were presented and affirmed at the Assembly, at the Congress, the first Congress in 1995. And Ellen then took a copy of that and took them to the then director of the National Cancer Institute, fairly new in his role, Dr. Richard Klausner, and said, I'd really like you to read these. I think these are very important. The imperatives for care is a very important document. He apparently was leaving for travel, going to Israel or something like that. I can't remember. He left town, read the paper. He's quick study. He came back, and he didn't even go to his senior staff, as the story goes. He went right downtown, and basically in one of the hearings at Congress said he was creating this Office of Cancer Survivorship to understand what were the long-term and late consequences of living with this history. Because most of the research portfolio at that time, funded by the NCI, was acute effects. So it would follow you through treatment, and then it was kind of good luck, you're out the door, have a good life. So all the kinds of things that Susie would talk about as the late effects that would show up later or persistent over time didn't really go away, were not really a focus of research. And that is why he created the office. They had a wonderful ceremony, a rose garden with President Clinton, who signed the ribbon of hope. And the office was launched by Dr. Anna Meadows, a world-renowned pediatric oncologist, in 1996, autumn of 1996.
And how did you come to be the director of it?
So Ellen had a plan.
I know, that's what I wanted to hear you say.
She had this figured out. So she got the imperatives. She then, the office was created, and then she turned around and started lobbying me. Very gently, in her loving way that she could, but just sort of saying, you think about this position. I think you'd be really good at it. Anna Meadows really doesn't want it full time. They're looking for a full-time director. I think you should think about it. And after Alan had talked to me, and one of my patients who was politically connected said, why at the NCI said, well, why aren't you applying for this job? And then a colleague who said, oh, I applied for the job. How haven't you? I said, well, I think I really ought to apply for this job. And I did. And the coup de grace really, if you were to hear Ellen tell the story, when she told the story, she said she thought a particular reason why I was hired is I had to go to an interview with Dr. Klausner for the position, because there was some question about whether it should sit in the office of the director, the NCI director, as opposed to further down in the structure of the NCI. And Ellen told Rick, he said, I think she's the best candidate. I really think you should hire her. And by the way, she has a great sense of humor. And Ellen would swear that that's why they hired me.
She was right.
Yes. And she did have that way of really sweetly, but very, persistently and firmly pushing for what she thought needed to be done. So thank you. That's great. Judy mentioned that, she wanted to include in this biography the histories of both oncology nursing and psycho-oncology as well. And so I'd love to hear from all of you, really, but Susie as an oncology nurse and Julia as a clinician and researcher and teacher in the area of psycho-oncology, about the role of both of oncology nursing and psycho-oncology in the survivorship movement. So maybe Julia, you can go first, and then I'd love to hear from each of you about it.
the parallel track that was taking place, and I really feel very fortunate in my career that I was in the sort of ground floor of two major movements. And the first of those was really the movement of psycho-oncology, psychosocial aspects of cancer. And the reason why that became a fairly big part of the survivorship movement is because the early studies were really looking at how patients cope with illness and died of illness. So it was really in the backyard of psychiatry, psychology, the mental health spectrum in here. It wasn't about living with cancer at all. Because most people, if you looked in 1971, only 48% of people diagnosed in that year would be alive in 5 years. And one of the brilliant things that the coalition did with the definition was to change the philosophy of care and say, first of all, the majority of people in 1986 are living 5 years or beyond, so well over 50%. You can't put your life on hold to make a decision about what your life's going to be like, because by then a lot of treatment options had already been removed if you'd wanted to spare a limb or fertility or other functional areas. You need to decide that before you're exposed to the treatment. And so they basically said, you have to have these conversations at day one, which is why the definition is someone could call themselves optional, survive from day one. But what was not optional, and they hoped, was the discussion, the dialogue. They wanted to change the conversation, and they wanted that to happen at diagnosis to go forward. So that's just for the definition. But going back to the sort of whole field of psycho-oncology, I was lucky to fall into the backyard of Dr. Jimmy Holland, who's really the grandmother of that whole field, and worked with her, put the first handbook out in that area, and got very involved in sort of survivorship kinds of things. What happens to people afterwards if they're living long-term with this? What are the consequences of that? And so that kind of naturally led into the survivorship arena. I started in pediatrics, worked my way up through adult, got really involved in this. So when the whole survivorship field took off, I think I was at least the 88 conference, if not the 87 conference in Albuquerque. But found out very early because I'd set up a post-treatment Memorial Sloan Kettering, first of its kind in the country, and doing non-medical care to people who are post-treatment, which was very novel at the time and controversial even within Memorial. But that sort of launched the whole, let's look at the long-term and late effects. So from a psychosocial point of view, we were early in the game on the psychosocial aspects. Interestingly, in pediatric outcomes, the focus was much more on the medical. So we had a lot of data, early data was on medical sequelae or medical outcomes of treatment. And for adults, it was in psychosocial outcomes. We're seeing the absolute reverse of that now. So a lot of the long-term studies in children who are surviving now into young adulthood is looking at the psychosocial employment, intimate relationships, well-being. And now we're looking at the medical long-term sequelae in adults, which we know are considerable.
Great, thank you. So Susie, how about talk a little bit about oncology nursing and its growth?
Well, I needed to find a job once I recovered, and I wanted to do something that made me feel worthwhile again. So I said, I want to be an oncology nurse because there's a whole lot that we need to learn here. And over the time, I got to tell you, what I love to tell my oncology nursing colleagues who came into this around 1975 is when they started the society, and I became an oncology nurse in 1976. And there was no training for it. It was all really on the job. You worked with the docs. What I like to tell them is, if I only knew in 1972 what I learned from my oncology nurse colleagues a few years later, I would have been terrified, because only physicians could give us chemotherapy in 1972. And they would come in, they'd let the nurse hang the bags of saline and inject some of the medications in some of the bags, but only the physician could come in and actually insert the needle and then do the infusion. And they didn't know what they were doing any more than anyone else did at that time, because it was so new. And then I started learning as an oncology nurse. how if any of that slipped out of the vein, you've got these terrible, terrible burns and necrosis of the skin and all this stuff. So I always like to tell the oncology nurses that after having gotten some of my chemotherapy in my antecubital veins, which are the ones that they usually draw blood from, and ruined them, oncology nurses just came in and became incredible techniques in the delivery of care, but they also had the time to sit there. Docs didn't have time to sit with us. They're busy doing other things, like creating plans and seeing patients. But the nurses were there to sit with us and help us with the symptoms that we had to deal with. So oncology nursing started before I got in, like I said, a little before I got in, because nurses were being asked to come in and help with the delivery of care. And they finally said, boy, we need a lot more specialized information and education so that we can help people through this, not only with the delivery of medications, brand new medications, but then with dealing with families, the trauma the families were going through, dealing with, all of the issues that may come up down the road, immediately down the road, like infertility, sexual issues, the discrimination issues, the fear of recurrence. So it was just an absolute treasure to see, the nursing community move into this area so that we could be part of the team with our medical and radiation oncologists, and eventually with our social workers and psychologists, with the nutritionists who came on board. And it really started becoming a real team effort.
Thanks, Susie. So Judy, you want to talk a little bit more about what you learned about both of these two sort of aspects of the survivorship movement and how you portrayed them in the book?
Well, so as Susie explained, we'll start with oncology social work, oncology nurses first. These nurses had no way to share information. They were learning about techniques. They were learning about some of the dangers of handling the drugs. And they had nowhere to share that information, no one to chat with about the issues that they might have felt with regard to their patients, plus how to handle the patient's psychosocial issues. So the Oncology Nursing Society was just, again, when we look back, it seems like, well, duh, but it was such a huge leap forward for, I can say firsthand, the angels of cancer treatment. And they began very humbly. One of the founders had gone to an attorney before they met for their official meeting and to organize. And he said, well, you'll never be able to do that. You might just as well join with some other organization and stop trying to be your own thing. And of course they said, no, we're not going to do that. And created their own charter. And much of this book, the growth of oncology nursing and the growth of NCCS, we have to remember occurred before the internet, before fax machines, at a time when long distance calls came with a price. So just about everything went by the US mail. But the nurses started with a dedicated group at that very first meeting of about 50. And it was in May of 1975. They left charter membership open till the end of the year. And at the end of the year, they had hundreds of charter members. It was really astounding. It was really wonderful. The same was true, I think, with oncology social work, which the late Betsy Clark was a wonderful resource, not only for NCCS information, historical information, but also for the history of oncology social work, just as Julia was for psycho-oncology. Those disciplines are every bit as necessary as the medical part of it, because cancer plays with what's between your ears just as much as it does with your body.
Right.
You know, as Susie talked about, the fear of recurrence, it's a psychological suit. PTSD, guilt, did I cause this? What have I done to my family? I mean, there were so many issues that now are much more easily talked through.
Great, thank you, all of you. So Judy, tell us, what are some of the most interesting and surprising things you learned about NCCS or just about the survivorship movement during your research? What were some of your favorite finds in all of your digging?
So like you said you're what kind of
Policy
a
wonk.
You're a policy wonk. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a research wonk, research junkie, whatever you want to call it. So this newspaper database that I subscribed to was wonderful because it allowed me to find newspaper articles about NCCS and all of the early members and the early events. These articles written at the time with the verbiage at the time. It was so funny. There were articles where Ellen was quoted and the headline of the article would still say, "Cancer victim speaks out." And I'm sure she just wanted to pull her hair out. Why do they keep calling us this? And that was in the 90s. Mm-hmm. But I think, so all of that to me was so important to hear their voices in these articles and you could just hear their enthusiasm at building this. And just like we find it difficult to think of a non-internet world or a non-fax machine world, it's equally difficult to think about a non-survivorship accepted world, but yet that's the world that they all lived in. And this book is many things, but it's also a very clear blueprint for how to start a social movement, apparently, because what they built from very humble beginnings, I just keep saying this in interviews, it's changed the lives for millions around the world, not just here in the United States, but the way we view survivors has certainly traveled beyond our borders. And I think that's just an astounding accomplishment.
Well, that was my next question to all of you was, what do you see as the most important accomplishments of the survivorship movement? So I'll start with you, Judy, although I think you kind of just answered it, but I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, and then give Susie and Julia a chance to answer as well.
Again, I think acceptance is the biggest part. It's a groundswell. It's like anything else. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the AIDS movement, all began because there was great need for voices to be heard, for wrongs to be righted, for people who were disenfranchised to be welcomed back into the fold. And I think by a large margin, that was the greatest thing. And again, you know, I'm 10 years out, which to some may seem like a long time. I remember it like yesterday, of course, but I never felt disenfranchised. I always felt accepted. So I think that's because of the work that was done long before cancer came on my radar.
And Susie, you are at your 49-year mark from being diagnosed, which is incredible. So what would you say are some of the most important accomplishments of the survivorship movement?
Well, I think to me, the most important things when I hear survivorship as being just an integral part of cancer care nowadays. Everybody knows about survivorship, and they can't the healthcare community can't ignore it. But that's really only in oncology. If it's non-oncology specialists, they don't know about survivorship, and that's a huge challenge that we still have in front of us. But I think one of the things that I'm particularly concerned about, and I think we need to have more and more voices, is the area of long-term survivors. And I'm hearing now with COVID, they have people 6 months out of their COVID experience, and they're called long haulers. And we've got people who are long-term cancer survivors who are 20, 30, 40, 50 years out, and we can't get anybody to pay attention to them. So, you know, people don't know what is now happening to the people to the survivors who are really, really long-term survivors. And I think we need to pay a lot more attention to that. And it can't just be oncology, it's got to be medicine as a whole.
Great.
And
We've been talking about that for a long time.
could I just add, Susie pointed this out to me during one of our many conversations, not just so the survivors themselves feel supported, but it helps inform the science of oncology. If you do this, then down the road, this is what will happen. So it's an important teaching tool. Long-term survivors are important teaching tools as well.
Right.
So Julia, what would you say is the most important accomplishments?
Yeah, if you think back to the Cancer Act 50 years ago, celebrated this year, or this coming December will be 50 years. And the biggest testament to the success of that act, one would arguably say, is the growing population of survivors. You know, we have better earlier detection, we have better treatments, we have better supportive care. That should be like front page. Survivors are the great success story of all the work that's been done in this area. So to me, what the movement did was it, as everybody's saying, it gave voice to the fact that this population's big. If you look at in the United States, we have 16.9 million individuals with a cancer history. The bulk of them are in survivorship. You know, you have a subset that are about a year out from diagnosed treatment, active treatment. There's another smaller subset that, if you do, you know, the statistical manipulations, are within a year of death. But the bulk of that group is in that survivor mode. So what it did is not only gave voice to that population, but said on the cancer control continuum, with a lot of the scientific committee looks at, which goes from prevention and detection and treatment. And it used to go up, end of life. Now we realize, oh my gosh, there's this huge space in here called, survivorship. This is what it's all about. And a lot of people are going to spend a lot of time in that, decades for growing numbers. And what happens, I think the other thing that I think is going to be new is we've been arguing what happens when you're in that, you loop back again. We got to be worried about prevention of comorbid disease or prevention of a new cancer. We got to be detecting those early. Maybe you're retreated and maybe you're going to cycle back again and die of something else, or possibly your cancer. But it's not linear for survivors. It starts all over again. And that's a very important model, because it brings in what Susie says is we need a larger medical community to understand that if they have patients in their practice who have this history, they need to know different information. And I think that's something we really have to be aware of. And I think it's a huge contribution that's been made, is that that's why you have to argue. You've got to be thinking about this from day one, whether you call yourself a survivor or not. They never meant it. The coalition never meant it as a label. They never meant it as a label. They wanted to get rid of the use of the word victim. They wanted to convey a message of hope. They wanted to start the dialogue.
Right. So I think these are all important contributions and accomplishments. And yet, you know, while Susie, you're absolutely right, survivorship can't be ignored. I still feel like that frustration that we still have a lot to do. And I guess that's part of advocacy. There's always going to be a lot to do. So what would you say is the most important next steps for the survivorship movement? Any of you can answer first, whoever wants to.
All right, my three.
Okay.
First and foremost, our advances have not been equitably distributed. So
Absolutely.
we have huge health disparities in this field that we have to address. So that number one area. The second is we're returning people to some kind of a life, but we're still focused on lifespan and not health span. We really have to be looking at rehab of people systematically, and their health behaviors after a diagnosis. So we are underutilizing that. We could probably even do better with our treatments if we are really engaging people in those. And the third group, of course, my passion is we have to be looking at caregivers. The burden on caregivers' family is now enormous, because most of this care is on the outpatient basis. Family members are expected to be medical extenders. They're looking after, they're burdened by this, and we don't help them. And that's not okay.
Well, that was very succinct. It's almost like you were prepared for that. And I didn't tell you that I was going to ask you that exactly, but I guess you probably guessed it. You're always prepared. Susie, how about you? What do you think is the most important next step?
I think the whole area of educating our patients as they go off therapy. What I see happening nowadays is we wait until they come to that last treatment before we start talking about what they have to look forward to, and we scare the bejesus out of them. People say, I don't want to hear that stuff when I'm here. I want to go ring the bell. I want to go have a cake. I want to have a party. I don't want to think about what may happen down the road. But I was just talking to one of my doctor colleagues yesterday, and I said, if we only start talking about the survivorship issues and the continuum right up front, when people are vulnerable, they're looking for help, and we say, this is what we're going to do to help you. Now, in fact, it may have some consequences down the road, but if we know about it, as we go along, then you get them used to the idea of learning about what to look forward to. So I think we have to learn how to communicate the survivorship continuum a little better, I think, for our patients. And that also means the whole area of further developing survivorship care plans, whatever they look like. They don't have to look like really formalized plans that are really, really hard to do and confusing and take a lot of time. But we have to send people home with something. And this something has got to go to primary care, to gynecology, to cardiology, whoever's going to be seeing us in the future. Because my really kind of severe late effects didn't happen for 17 years until 17 years later. Now, of course, I was younger when I was treated, and many of our elderly, who are our biggest population of people being diagnosed with cancer, may not live long enough to have the kind of problems that those of us who are younger have. But 17 years breast cancer, and then it was like 24 years of something, bladder cancer. And it was, 5 years ago, for me, it was lung cancer and the cardiac effects. And so there was no preparation for that. And docs who are seeing, we're often not seeing oncologists. So I think we have to have much better education of our primary care docs, because those are the ones who are going to be first line for picking up money in many of the problems that we have. So, I think there's an incredible amount of work to do. And also, people don't know, our survivors don't know about NCCS. We've got to get word out there that NCCS is available and other resources are available. Mm-hmm. And how do people find those resources that are credible when we have so much on the internet now? Yeah. So our work is cut out for us.
Yeah. So Judy, do you have anything you want to add to the discussion of what's the most important next step?
Well, they used up a lot of the good stuff, but but I do, and Susie actually touched on it a little bit. There's a quote that Margaret Mead, a comment that Margaret Mead made that is often quoted, but I think really fits at this point, and that is, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. In fact, it's the only thing that ever has. That's what they were in Albuquerque. Mm-hmm. And they have left breadcrumbs for the rest of us as survivors to follow. The only way any movement goes forward is with more people stepping up into the movement. And ironically, before cancer, I was researching for a book, and I had come across information about the health benefits of volunteering in any form. Doesn't matter what form it takes. There is healing in helping. And so I think it's an important message for survivors to get involved in something to help other people. And NCCS and the education about survivorship is a perfect way. It's a perfect next step.
And we hear that from advocates who volunteer with us too, that by advocating for others and helping others, it really helps them just as much. So I know it's 8 o'clock. on the East Coast, but I have one more question I really want to ask. And I'm guessing that we're not all back to back with meetings during the day, like we are during the day. So this was a great question from Wendy Harpham, which is a two-part question. What do you hope will happen because of the book? And what difference do you hope reading the book makes in the life and work of clinicians who read it? I think I'll start with you, Judy, since you wrote it, and I would love if Susie and Julia want to chime in afterward as well.
Well, again, the idea that learning about this history, learning about what this small group of people did, I'm hoping is a blueprint for others, whether they advocate and volunteer for NCCS or anybody else. My idea is always, my hope is that we can host lots of these. I'll talk to anybody anytime about this history because I think it's just so incredibly important. And then as far as clinicians go, I'm going to borrow a line of Susie's. She said in an interview that I watched that survivors are really the canaries in the coal mine, as we've already talked about. But she also said that survivorship is the success story of oncology. So I'd like clinicians to know that they're doing a great job, that survivorship is the next part of the cancer continuum, and it's important to remember that. And again, as a historian, anytime you can pick up something about history, you can learn from history, that's a good thing. And this is certainly a history of nearly 17 million Americans alone.
Great. Thank you, Judy. How about you, Julia or Susie? Do either of you have anything you want to add?
I'm mindful of another quote, and that was by Natalie Davis Spingarn, who's the editor of the Networker, a longtime NCCS advocate, member, voice, even before we had NCCS. And she wrote famously that cancer is the gift that keeps on giving. And I think that this history informs people about that and allows them to recognize that it doesn't stop when treatments stop or the acute treatment stops. It goes on beyond that, and that we have an obligation to address what happens later, whether you're a clinician or a researcher or a healthcare system, that we need to attend to the needs of people living with that history. And if we do it well, we're going to have amazing health spans, and we can embrace that vision of hope that the coalition put forward when it first met in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
And so, Susie, as one of our founding members, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I think one thing that I would like our clinicians to know is how much we appreciate them. And I often talk about all of the problems that we have, and we're identifying a lot of the problems, but I think of our doctors, our nurses, our social workers, and everybody else involved in these teams, and they have made a personal decision to go into oncology and work with a population of patients who, it can be difficult, very, very difficult work, because we don't know who's going to do well and who's not. So I just really, really appreciate the fact that they are there for us. On the other hand, I want them to learn from us. And please listen to the issues that we are bringing up, because that's going to certainly improve the kind of care they can give by helping us prepare to go on to the next phase. So I think that this kind of conversation that we're having because of Judy's book is going to really, really go far in creating dialogue and communication to help us all understand what we're all going through in difficult situations, and certainly in situations that we can celebrate.
Thank you, Susie. And I want to thank all of you so much for joining us tonight, our panelists, and Judy for writing this book, and Susie and Julia for joining us for the conversation. I also want to thank the NCCS team who helped put this on and all of you for joining us. You can get your copy of the book on Amazon, and we have a link to it in the chat and also on our website. Also, there's a great article that was posted about the health benefits of volunteering in the chat, so you can check that out as well. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and thank you, Judy, for writing this. We really appreciate all of you.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Night.
Bye, everybody.